All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Good evening. I'm Santa Clara County Supervisor Joe Simitian, and I want to welcome you to what I think is our 7th annual town hall about Lehigh Southwest Cement and Permanente Quarry. And I began holding these meetings, when I first returned to the Board of Supervisors, because it was my sense that the community had questions and that it wasn't always easy to figure out how to get those questions answered, quite frankly. So tonight, my hope is that we'll be able to get answers to your questions and the questions that you and your neighbors have, and many of which we hear quite frequently, and want to be able to try and get as many of them answered tonight as we possibly can. To that end, we have a panel of federal, state, and local regulators here to answer the questions and provide some I'll provide some brief background remarks on my part, but then we will get straight into questions that are relevant to the operations at Lehigh Quarry and Cement Plant. I do think it's important, by way of background information, for me to just share a little bit of background about the state of affairs when I came back on the Board of Supervisors in 2013. Prior to that time, previous boards had taken a couple of very important actions. In 2011, the Board of Supervisors made a determination on what's known as vested rights. And I apologize for the jargon, but some of this technical background is essential. So as I say, in 2011, the Board of Supervisors made a determination on vested rights, and they determined essentially where mining activity could occur without a use permit, and what areas would require a use permit if mining activities were to take place. Probably something like 2,200 acres out of the 3,500 acres on the site are now vested for mining activity as a result of that action, and proposals to mine outside that 2,200 acres would require a use permit from the county. The other important action is that in 2012, the previous Board of Supervisors approved an amendment to the quarry's reclamation plan. That's the plan for how does this all get put back together again one day, we hope. And that probably covers something like 1,200 acres, maybe a bit more, out of the 3,500 acres. So those are two very important prior decisions, the results of which we live and work with today. As I say, the rec plan outlines the plan and timing for how the site will be restored once the mining activity comes to an end. Both of those rulings, the vested rights determination and the reclamation plan amendment, were subject of some controversy. Quite frankly, they ended up in court. So they were both subject to judicial review. And in both cases, the decision of the prior board and the county was upheld. The county's position was prevailed. So the vested rights in the reclamation plan that were approved all those years ago are in place, and we live and work with them today as a result. Since being sworn in back in 2013, when I came back on the board after my time in the state legislature, my office and I have taken some steps to try and increase oversight and accountability in ways that are, I think fairly described as incremental, but that I hope and believe that taken together have actually been significant in their impact. Among the things that have, I think, changed for the better, we now have boots on the ground with inspections from the county monthly. That was not the case previously. I thought it was important and helpful to understanding what was happening on the site. We now have a series of regularly scheduled coordinated meetings between and among the federal, state, and local regulatory agencies. You're going to hear from a dozen different folks tonight, and as you'll see, it's complex and hard to figure out sometimes how the pieces fit together. So I thought it was important to make sure that folks were sitting around the table together and sharing information. We did a review of the various requirements that were in place to make sure they were all being met, and discovered that there was a missing surety bond, a guarantee that was required by the cement plant. So that's been restored. Sometimes it's simple things like just asking our planning department to please improve and upgrade the website so people can get information more easily. We've certainly had more frequent updates to both the Board of Supervisors and the Housing, Land Use, Environment, and Transportation Committee, on which I sit with my colleague, Supervisor Mike Wasserman, to make sure we stay up to date on this. We instituted monthly calls between my office and the folks at Lehigh so that we could share our concerns and observations on a regular basis, and they could fill us in on what was happening on the site from their point of view. Routine noise monitoring was something that we pushed for and that the county then engaged in. More recently, and I was very pleased about this, we agreed to share enforcement authority for our Ridgeline easement. That's the protection that exists for the top of the site with the folks at the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District. So we have sort of a double protection there. I call it a belt and suspenders to make sure. We've asked for outside review of the financial assurance cost estimates submitted by Lehigh. That's to make sure that if and when the mining activities come to an end, that there are sufficient resources to put the site back together in good order. Want to make sure that that gets done and that the public doesn't get stuck for that tab. Also recently asked for a review of violations over the past 10 years so we could sort of take stock of how well the facility was or wasn't abiding by the various rules, regulations, and laws governing their activity. These annual town halls were also something that we began, 7, 8, 9 years ago now. And I didn't know that at the time, but people really do seem to value the opportunity to get their questions asked and answered. So thank you again, folks, for joining us tonight. We have 225 folks in the meeting tonight. That's more than we've had in any year past, to the best of my recollection, either virtual or in person. So thank you again for coming. And perhaps most recently, some of you are aware, I asked my colleagues on the Board of Supervisors to direct our county staff to come back to our board with some options for the county acquisition of the site. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that if there are questions, but it just seemed to me it was time to start asking ourselves, what's the long-term future of this property with some deliberate thought rather than simply sit back and wait and see what happens. As I mentioned, this is the 7th public meeting of this type where you, the public, are given a chance to get an update on regulatory activities and ask questions of the agencies that regulate the quarry and the cement plant. So thank you for doing that. Before we get to those questions, I do want to recognize some elected officials and others who have RSVP'd, and I want to thank them and their representatives for being here. And I'm sure I will miss somebody, so forgive me in advance. And these are only folks who registered with us early that we were able to capture. And if we miss someone, please let us know from the elected official ranks. Though in Cupertino, Mayor Darcy Paul, along with council members Kitty Moore and Hung Wei and John Willey from Cupertino, as I say, thank you. From Los Altos, council members Nisa Fleiger, Sally Meadows, and Jonathan Weinberger are with us, excuse me, Jonathan. Mayor George Tyson from Los Altos Hills also in the mix. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mayors Pat Burt of Palo Alto and Larry Klein of Sunnyvale. From the Valley Water Board, we have Director Nai Shui. Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District, who I mentioned earlier. We have a number of their directors sitting in. Thank you, Jed Sear and Karen Holman, Yuriko Kishimoto, Kurt Riffle, and Pete Siemens, again, all from Mid-Penn. Patrick Ahrens, the president of the Foothill De Anza College District Board of Trustees. Tom Pike and Olivia Rodriguez are with us from Congressman Ro Khanna's office. We thank them. And Celeste Walker is with us from Assemblymember Evan Lowe's office. So thank you all for being here. And again, if we've been joined by one of our or more of our other elected officials, do let us know and we'll try and make sure we recognize your presence. And for those of you who are wondering how the evening will unfold, because it's virtual, so they're going to be a little bit different than when we were all gathered together in the community room there in Cupertino. We won't be asking you to write your questions on cards and handing them to staff from my office. Instead, we will work through questions that we collected in advance of tonight's session. We asked folks as they registered to please share their questions, and a number of you did so, so thank you for that. And we have enabled the Q&A function that Zoom offers so that if you're watching at home, you can submit your questions online. And to do that, you simply type your question in and I will pose it to our panel. Again, we're using that Q&A function that I see some of you have already found, and we will not be using the raised hand function. So I don't want you to head in that direction. Again, we will not be using the raised hand function. Your questions can go into that Q&A function that Zoom offers, and I suspect a lot of you are quite familiar with it at this point. I'm going to begin by asking our panel members as we go member by member to introduce themselves, give us a brief update on what they've been up to over the past year with respect to Lehigh. And then I will ask some of the questions that were submitted during the registration process while we generate a question queue at that Q&A function tonight. We're going to wrap things up promptly at 8:30 so everybody can get a good night's sleep. And if you have a question, again, don't forget to submit it through the Q&A function on Zoom. And I should mention, as in years past, we will try to answer questions online and post them on my website, Supervisor Simitian. We can't always get to every question because we rely on the various agencies to help with responses that are specific to their organization. But we get to a great many, I would say most, if not all. So if your question doesn't get asked tonight because there are time constraints, we will try our level best to get it up on line once the discussion concludes tonight. And I should mention then that tonight's meeting is both live streamed and recorded, and it will be made available on my website, supervisorsimitian.org, for those who just didn't get enough of the regulatory conversation tonight, or if you've got friends or neighbors who would like to participate and join us at some other time. So again, thank you. I see we're pushing almost 240 folks who are on tonight. Again, thank you for your interest and your willingness to give a piece of your evening to this conversation. I do want to also thank the panelists for attending this evening's meeting. I think at the risk of stating the obvious, it's outside normal business hours. We really do appreciate their attendance, and I know that our constituents really do appreciate it because we hear every year from folks who say how much they appreciate the opportunity to have their questions addressed. So thank you again to all of you who could make it. Unfortunately, I should say that the Regional Water Quality Control Board declined to participate this year. So we may struggle a little bit or be unable to answer some of your water-related questions in real time. And again, that's only because the folks at the Regional Water Quality Control Board just chose to decline to participate tonight. And we will ask them again next year and hope that they'll be able to participate at that time. So panelists, as I say, please briefly introduce yourself when I call on you. Tell us your name, your agency's name, give us a brief overview of what you regulate at Lehigh. And then I'll have a couple of questions for each of the panelists to help get us started. We'll move our way through the panel, starting with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and they'll be followed by folks at Fish and Wildlife. So with that cue, let me turn to Ms. Brumbaugh and ask you to introduce yourself, tell us who you're with and what it is you do in connection with Lehigh. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity for allowing us to participate. My name is Roshni Brumbaugh. I am the Air Enforcement Manager for EPA Region 9. And our responsibility is to ensure compliance and proceed with enforcement activities related to any stationary source facilities in the Region 9, which includes California and specifically Lehigh. Right now, our activities have been primarily monitoring the consent decree that we entered with Lehigh last year. In November 2020. So I didn't know if we wanted to go further into a little bit about the consent decree, We, just to remind everyone about something we spoke about last year during the meeting, was just the fact that we, as an EPA, the Clean Air Act Division had alleged that there were violations of some physical modifications that were made to the Lehigh Cupertino facility. And we noticed that other Lehigh facilities across the nation had similar violations. So we had, to resolve the violations at Lehigh in Cupertino, as well as across the nation, we entered into a global consent decree. And a consent decree is a opportunity for the facilities as well as the government to come together to come to a resolution. And as a result of this, the Cupertino facility has agreed to reduce emissions of their nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide from the kiln. And there's lower emission limits that have been set for this facility. Supervisor Simitian, you're muted.
You would think after 2 years I'd know better. Thank you for that, Roshni. I started to say you anticipated my first question very well, which was about the settlement and the consent decree. Let me just ask, can you update us all on excuse me, where things stand with the required improvements at this point?
Yes, due to the temporary cessation of kiln operations, there has been a temporary shutdown, and there has been a bit of an extension and delay in terms of what the consent decree requirements are. However, there are certain requirements that are not dependent on kiln operations. However, there are a significant number, such as the emission limits that are set for the sulfur dioxide lime injection system that needs to be installed, that will be based on the kiln operation. So once the facility does restart, we'll be able to give you a better update in terms of where the requirements are at.
All right, we will be back to you with questions, I know, but thank you for that introduction and update on the settlement and consent decree. Let me move on to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife now. And they'll be followed by the Air District, by the way. So let me ask who from Fish and Wildlife would like to do the introductions for us. And then I've got a few questions to get us started there.
This is Ryan. I can start.
Go right ahead.
Sure. I'm Ryan Ola. I'm the Division Supervisor of our Coast Bay Division for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Sacramento. We are currently working with Lehigh on a habitat conservation plan for the quarry that covers maintenance of stormwater detention ponds and the safe relocation of threatened California red-legged frogs that have taken up residence in the ponds. We're also working with Lehigh on the restoration of Permanente Creek, and that's kind of an ongoing consultation that we're working on with the Army Corps of Engineers.
And could you just flesh out for us a little bit? There's something called a habitat conservation plan, the species that it covers and how that plan works to help ensure the long-term viability of the species on the site?
Yeah, I can actually take that.
Yeah, Joseph prepared that one. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Joseph Terry. I'm a senior biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Endangered Species Division. I'm the lead for Santa Clara County, and as Ryan said, I'm the point person involved in regulating endangered species on the Lehigh property, specifically the federally threatened California red-legged frog. Recently, through helping them develop a habitat conservation plan, as well as we have other take permits we've issued to Lehigh for various activities like culvert maintenance. So yeah, to your question about what is a habitat conservation plan and what species it covers. So just a little bit of background. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or the service, works with private landowners to conserve important habitat for listed species. Whenever a landowner wants to build or undertake a major project on their land that could impact a listed species, they need to develop a habitat conservation plan, or HCP. A landowner's HCP will include information about the project, the listed species found in the project area, and what impacts the construction and activity may have on those listed species. After reviewing the HCP developed by the landowner, the service can help determine whether a project or action is likely to result in take of illicit species and whether a permit is needed, as well as work with the landowner to reduce the impacts of their project on illicit species. Take does not always equate to kill. It has a much broader definition under the Federal Endangered Species Act. A take permit is required for projects that could result in harassing, harming, capturing, injuring, or killing a federally listed species. We reviewed a habitat conservation plan developed by Lehigh for the excavation of stormwater detention basins on their property in order to complete needed repairs and maintenance, as well as implement erosion control measures near Permanente Creek. Lehigh developed the HCP after observing California red-legged frogs, which are federally listed as threatened species, in the detention basins. Lehigh is proposing to relocate the frogs out of harm's way to a breeding pond at the downstream end of their property. This relocation activity requires a take permit as it involves capturing illicit species. Under the HCP, Lehigh will manage, monitor, and restore, if needed, the frog breeding pond at the downstream end of their property throughout the 20-year permit term for the HCP. Lehigh will also minimize effects to frogs through biological monitors and limiting work to when the detention basins are dry. The HCP also states that Lehigh will fund the preservation and management in perpetuity 6.6 acres of high quality habitat for the California red-legged frog off-site within the same recovery unit for the frog as Lehigh's project.
All right. And to this use of the term take permit, I think you provided some good context there, Mr. Terry, so thank you for that. But could you just give us sort of a layperson's definition of what a take permit is and how it's part of this larger conservation effort?
Sure. So a take permit is required under the Endangered Species Act for projects that could result in harassing, harming, capturing, injuring, or killing a federally listed species. Take permits are issued to non-federal applicants through the development of habitat conservation plans, and take permits are issued to federal agencies through biological opinions. As I said previously, Lehigh is proposing to relocate the frogs out of harm's way to a breeding pond at the downstream end of their property. This relocation activity requires a take permit and development of a habitat conservation plan as it involves capturing illicit species. While Lehigh will minimize the potential for injuring or killing frogs, such as through biological monitors and working only when the detention basins are dry, Lehigh is also requesting a take permit in case any frogs are incidentally injured or killed during work within the detention basins. And as I said previously, the HCP also includes monitoring and managing the breeding pond at the downstream end of their property for the benefit of the frog and funding the preservation and management in perpetuity of 6.6 acres of high quality habitat for the frog off-site within the same recovery unit. Some other examples of take permits with Lehigh. In 2020, we issued a 5-year take permit to Lehigh through a biological opinion with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for maintaining culverts in Permanente Creek. The take permit included biological monitoring and relocating frogs to the breeding pond at the downstream end of their property. Under a prior take permit in 2017 for emergency culvert maintenance work in Permanente Creek, Lehigh successfully relocated 22 California red-legged frogs to the breeding pond at the downstream end of their property without any injuries or mortalities. Overall, when the service works with private landowners and federal agencies to limit and minimize impacts on illicit species through the development of habitat conservation plans, and biological opinions, we can achieve good conservation outcomes for listed species.
Got it. Thank you. Mr. Ola, you were obviously wise to have a phone a friend ready at your disposal. Let me just ask one more question, if I may. Briefly, could you just help us understand the role that the service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, plays with respect to the restoration work that's being planned for Permanente Creek? The creek, of course, has been a subject of considerable interest and conversation.
Sure. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or the Corps, is the federal lead agency for the Permanente Creek Restoration Project. The service is working with the Corps and Lehigh to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the effects of the creek restoration project on the California red-legged frog, and to include habitat features for the benefit of the frog. The Corps initiated consultation with the service on the creek restoration project in 2017. Within 2 months, the service issued a letter to the Corps requesting additional information. It is our understanding that Lehigh has recently revised and expanded the scope of the creek restoration project. Once the service receives the revised project description, the service will review the project to ensure any effects to the frog are avoided, minimized, and mitigated. Then the service will issue a take permit for the creek restoration project.
All right, thank you for that. Before I go on to our next presentation, I should mention we have hit 250 participants. Thank you again to everybody who joined us tonight. One of those participants, by the way, is Councilmember Lynette Lee Eng from Los Altos, who has also joined us, and we welcome her and thank her for her participation. All right, we're going to move on now to the Air District. I believe Mr. Marvin is the one who's going to step up. Appreciate your participation. And after we hear from the Air District and Mr. Marvin, we'll go to our County Counsel's office. So Mr. Marvin, why don't you introduce yourself if you would, and tell us who you're with and what you do in connection to Lehigh Cement Plant Quarry.
Yeah, so I'm John Marvin. I'm a manager with the Compliance and Enforcement Division at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. We're generally known as the Air District. So that's the easiest way to remember us. We were formed back in 1955, and we were the first regional air quality agency in the nation. And we've led the effort to reduce air pollution and protect public health in the Bay Area. We're comprised of 9 counties, or we operate in 9 counties surrounding the Bay. And we're mainly responsible in terms of Lehigh for regulating stationary sources of air pollution. Lehigh is one of our permitted facilities, has many sources that are permitted with us. There's rules and regulations that they have to comply with. And we oversee the regulatory aspect of air pollution control. Our district mission is to create a healthy breathing environment for every Bay Area resident while protecting and improving public health, air quality, and the global climate.
And let me just ask, one of the things that we hear about in my office, and I know you hear about in your office, is the visible emissions at the facility. That's something, of course, that the Air District can look into, if I recall correctly. Could you help remind all of us how people report visible emissions to the Air District for investigation, if they would like to do that?
Yeah, so the public may report air quality complaints to the Air District's 24-hour complaint line. That's at 1-800-334-ODOR or 6367, or report it online at our website, www.baaqmd.gov.
I'm going to ask you to repeat both of those, and then I'm going to ask my team to make sure that they post and provide that contact information just to make sure people get access to it. Could I ask you to do that one more time, please?
Of course. Our complaint line is 1-800-334-ODOR or 6367. And our website to report complaints is www.baaqmd.gov.
All right. And, is there a particular type of air monitoring taking place at the facility on a routine basis? And if so, what is that? That air quality, big topic, big issue. If you can help us understand a little bit more specifically what it is you all are focused on, that would be helpful.
Sure. Well, there are several different ways that we monitor air quality over at Lehigh, or monitor emissions at Lehigh. We use, they have to have continuous emissions monitoring systems on a number of their sources at the kiln. Parametric monitoring is also used. Annual source testing is required at the kiln. And there's also bag leak detection systems on their dust collectors, or not all of them, but some of them. And let me explain, because probably not everyone in the audience knows what SIMs are. So these continuous emission monitoring systems, they're used directly to measure nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, mercury, total hydrocarbons, ammonia, and other air emissions, and parameters from Lehigh's kiln on a continuous basis. So these are continuous monitors, continuous emission monitors. There's parametric monitoring, and that's used to continuously measure compounds such as dioxins and furans. These are toxics. And these use a surrogate parameter of kiln stack temperature. So by relating kiln stack temperature through source testing, we're able to determine a surrogate temperature that gives us an idea of what the emissions are for this particular chemical. The annual source testing is something that we require. Of course, with the kiln being down, it hasn't been done for the last year and a half or so. But we have annual source testing that's required, and it measures air emissions as well as toxics. And then the bag leak detection systems, these are systems that are located on dust collectors, or baghouses as we call them, and they're just there to detect leaks in the system so that it allows the facility to change out the bags if there is a leak detected. So these are some of the ways that emissions are monitored at the facility.
Mr. Marvin, let me ask you two questions. And one, I'm going to just throw you a little curveball here, and I apologize in advance. But, let's suppose you're at a holiday party rather than talking to 251 interested members of the community. And they said, what's the purpose of all that? I mean, a lot of the folks who are on the call or in the meeting tonight, have a pretty technical background and understanding of these issues. But, at the end of the year, because you do all this work, what do we know at the end of the year, hopefully, as a result? We then know.
Well, then we know what the emissions are from the facility. And so that's very important for us, especially with the continuous emission monitoring system. So we know what the emissions are, and we can relate that back to the rules and regulations that they have to comply with. So that gives us an idea of, is the facility complying?
And that compliance presumably is some indicator of air quality safety for both folks in the immediate vicinity of the facility as well as in the broader Bay Area, yes?
Yes, it does give an indication. I mean, there's other methods that we use for toxic air contaminants, but yes, you're exactly right.
And I'm just, if you could share with us, did the Air District record any violations at the facility during the 2021 calendar year that just passed? And if so, could you describe them briefly for us?
We actually didn't record any violations at the facility in 2021, nor have we this year. We've had, let me go on just for a second. We've had only 6 air quality complaints reported to us over that that time period also. We've had no reportable compliance activities, that is, things like breakdowns or emission excesses reported by the facility over the course of that same period. So it's been very quiet.
And I understand that you work for the Bay Area Air Quality Management District and not the folks at Lehigh, but you mentioned in passing pretty casually that the kiln was shut down. Could you tell folks who were part of the meeting tonight what that's about?
Well, I can't exactly say why it's shut down. I mean, that's a business decision that was made by Lehigh. It was probably a result of several issues, the pandemic, which greatly slowed the economy in the Bay Area. So the amount of cement needed in the Bay Area was greatly reduced. I understand that might have been one of the reasons why they have. But
your understanding is that the kiln has not been in operation during calendar year 2021. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And as other members of the panel have the opportunity and ability to tell us a little bit more about that, I think based on the questions that we've gotten, that is going to be of interest and importance to members of the public. So Mr. Marvin, let me say thank you. And we'll let you off the hook for a minute or two, and we'll turn to our county counsel's office. This is our legal office here at Santa Clara County. We have both Ms. Bianca and Mr. Rossi with us. So if one of you could lean in, make introductions, please. Tell us who you are, what you do in connection with Lehigh, and I'll have a early question for you, but you'll be followed by your colleagues here at the county from Environmental Health. So Ms. Bianca, Mr. Rossi, who's going to lead off?
Certainly, I'll go ahead and lead off. My name is Elizabeth Bianca. I'm a lead deputy county counsel for the Office of the County Counsel, and I'm here this evening with my colleague, Michael Rossi. And just by way of background, the Office of the County Counsel is the legal counsel for the Board of Supervisors, the county executive, and every county department and agency, and also numerous county boards and commissions. With respect to our work at Lehigh, I am counsel to the Department of Planning and Development, and I handle regulatory issues associated with the county's regulations and oversight at Lehigh, as well as issuance of entitlements, such as review of the Reclamation Plan Amendment. So that's my role, but I'll turn it over to my colleague, Michael, to share some of the work that he does with Lehigh.
Good evening, I'm Michael Rossi. I am also a lead deputy county counsel. I supervise our office's civil and code enforcement section. We represent the county to enforce the county ordinance code and the Surface Mining and Reclamation Act, also known as SMARA, with respect to quarries.
All right, thank you. I think, you know, Ms. Bianca, I know you will recall that sometime back, Lehigh sued the quarry over our approach to processing their rec plan amendment. Can you let us know where that lawsuit currently stands?
Yes. So I believe at the meeting last year, we had shared that Lehigh had filed a lawsuit in Santa Clara County Superior Court against the county relating to the processing of the 2019 Reclamation Plan Amendment application. Lehigh was challenging the county's determination that there would need to be what we termed as a vested rights consistency determination. And I'm going to kind of step back just a little. So as you mentioned earlier, Supervisor Simitian, in 2011, the County Board of Supervisors made a vested rights determination over a portion of Lehigh's property. And what a vested right means effectively is that it's a right to conduct a legal use of real property if that right existed prior to the adoption of a zoning ordinance. So in the case of Lehigh, they began mining activities before the county had adopted a zoning ordinance. And in 2011, the Board of Supervisors determined that certain parcels at Lehigh were vested. And what that effectively means is that there is not a use permit that would be required to conduct surface mining operations on those parcels. Our zoning ordinance also provides that when there is basically a proposal to expand within the geographic scope of the vested rights, that we need to evaluate for substantial change to ensure that that expansion doesn't exceed the previously granted vested rights. And so Lehigh was challenging the county's determination that we could kind of make a consistency determination and look at the application and determine whether what they were proposing, including a new pit, actually was an expansion or an intensification of the operation. The position Lehigh took was that their determination in 2011 by the Board of Supervisors was a final determination as to the vested rights. And the county's position is it was a final determination as to the geographic scope of the vested rights, but not to intensification or operation. So the county sought for the court to effectively dismiss the case because Lehigh, in our opinion, failed to state facts sufficient to constitute a cause of action. And in September of 2021, the court ruled in favor of the county by sustaining the county's request for dismissal. And importantly, the court dismissed the matter in a manner that Lehigh did not have a further opportunity to amend their complaint and prolong the litigation. Lehigh did not appeal the Superior Court's order to the Court of Appeals, and the decision of the Superior Court is final.
Thank you, Ms. Bianca. I'm going to try and take that very comprehensive explanation, which I think was really helpful, and simplify it. If I oversimplify it or incorrectly simplify it, please lean in and correct me. When people asked me about this, if I was doing sidewalk office hours, for example, in Cupertino, what I said is, yes, prior boards have made a vested rights determination, but if there's a new application, we have to make sure the new application really is consistent with that prior determination. And while there may be vested rights, just to be a little ridiculous, rather obviously the vested rights don't allow somebody to throw up a Bloomingdale's department store or a nuclear reactor on the site. So the reason the county wanted to have a hearing process was to make sure that whatever was in front of the county for consideration was consistent with that prior set of vested rights. Is that albeit a little bit silly, is that a fair characterization of the process?
That is correct.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And let me just ask if you or Mr. Rossi would like to tell us a little bit about the relatively recent agreement between the county and the folks at Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District that relates to the inspection and enforcement of the Ridgeline protection easement.
Certainly, I can jump in and really briefly describe that agreement. So I think first I would just like to provide some background. In 1972, the county and Kaiser Cement and Gypsum Corporation, which was Lehigh's predecessor, agreed to provide a scenic backdrop to the residents of the county to serve as a natural screen to the industrial operations that were being undertaken at Lehigh. And to the county's successors assigns by permanently preventing mining, quarrying, or other activities from lowering the ridgeline. And this agreement was codified in a recorded document that we refer to as the Ridgeline Protection Easement. And just kind of for situational, I guess, awareness, the ridgeline that's protected under this easement includes the area that is now Rancho San Antonio County Park that is owned by the county and managed by the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District, and also the Rancho San Antonio Open Space Preserve that is owned and operated by the district. And the goal of the easement is to really protect the ridgeline for the public. On June 22nd, the County Board of Supervisors approved a referral from Supervisor Simitian and Supervisor Lee to County Council to enter into discussions with Mid-Penn regarding a grant of enforcement rights associated with the easement, which would enable Mid-Penn to enforce the rights under what eventually became a memorandum of the agreement. So the idea was that Mid-Penn could step into the shoes of the county to enforce violations of the easement. And a violation of the easement would arise under the 1972 easement. The ridgeline needs to be maintained at a certain elevation. And if it is lowered as a result of Lehigh's activities, it effectively could constitute a violation of the easement, depending on the facts. In August, the Board of Supervisors approved a memorandum of agreement with the county and Mid-Penn. And importantly, this memorandum does two important things. First, it authorizes Mid-Penn to conduct inspections regarding the easement for the purpose of determining the preservation of the easement. And secondly, it authorizes the county or Mid-Penn to enforce any specific future violations of the easement. And so on a violation by violation basis, either the county could elect to enforce or Mid-Penn could elect to enforce. And importantly, given Mid-Penn's work as an open space district, they're very knowledgeable about the ridgeline, but just in general, the preservation of the ridgeline. So it's a welcome partnership between the county and Mid-Penn.
Thank you for that. And again, Ms. Pianca, I'm going to try and simplify. And if I oversimplify or incorrectly simplify, please feel free to lean in and correct or clarify. But for those who wonder what this effort was all about, there was, in fact, some expression of interest by the folks at Lehigh about expanding their mining opportunities into the protected ridgeline area. We have this protection through the legal process called an easement. And I grossly oversimplified by saying, look, what do we have to do if we want to make sure that they don't chop the top? That was my sort of shorthand for what we were trying to achieve or prevent in this case. And the answer was, well, the Board of Supervisors can always prevent that from happening, but just to make sure that you have reinforcements or somebody ready to step in if the Board of Supervisors doesn't, why don't we cooperate with our friends at Mid-Penn, the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District, to make sure we have a second set of folks who have the right to enforce this measure. So again, sort of a double measure of protection to make sure that no one would come along and chop the top, even if the Board of Supervisors or the county was prepared to go along with it, which I would hope they would not be. The folks at Mid-Penn could step up and provide that extra increment. How'd I do in terms of staying inside the lines, Ms. Bianca? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. You've got us all well schooled. And let me turn to Mr. Rossi, who is also in the County Council's office, because Mr. Rossi, it's your team that works with the property owners to help bring them into compliance if they've received a notice of violation, or an NOV as it's sometimes called. I wonder if you could just update us all on where Lehigh stands with respect to prior NOVs or notices of violation that have been issued. Where do things stand at the facility these days?
Right, so there are no currently issued NOVs against Lehigh. The last two NOVs against them were issued in 2019 and addressed an illegally graded haul road and sedimentation discharge from a portion of the quarry known as the Jaeger Yard. Both of those NOVs resulted in compliance during the compliance period. I should also note that noise has historically been an issue at Lehigh Quarry. The last noise NOV was issued in 2017 and also resulted in compliance during the compliance period.
All right. Well, I mentioned in passing earlier, Mr. Rossi, the request that we made for essentially a 10-year summary on violations. I know that you and your team have been an integral part of that. We'll probably have a question for you on that later, and I just wanted to sort of tee that up for you to be thinking about so I don't take you by surprise when the time comes, okay?
Thank you, Supervisor.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thanks, Ms. Bianca. And I want to turn now to the county's environmental health team. Ms. Gotti, why don't you go first, and then we'll let Mr. Pierce follow up, make some introductions, tell us who you are and what you do, and we'll start, as I say, with Ms. Gotti and then go to Mr. Pierce. Go to it.
Thank you, Supervisor Comedian. Good evening. My name is Rochelle Gotti. I'm with the Department of Environmental Health, the Consumer Protection Division. Our division enforces the noise sections of the Santa Clara County Ordinance Code. Since 2016, we have been conducting noise monitoring sessions at Lehigh, and we also respond to complaints.
All right. And before we go to Mr. Pierce, let me just ask, Ms. Gotti, you mentioned that you have the responsibility for noise monitoring. Any complaints or violations related to noise in 2021, to your knowledge?
In 2021, we received but one complaint.
One complaint.
Noise, correct.
All right. And any violations established during the year?
No, Supervisor. No violations recorded for 2021.
All right. And could you just tell us a little bit more about what your routine noise monitoring consists of?
So we do quarterly noise monitoring sessions. Our staff go out at various hours, typically at night when it's quiet, and we record those sessions, and all the results of these noise monitoring sessions are posted on the DPD website.
All right, thank you for that. Mr. Pierce, if I recall, it's your group that oversees the storage of hazardous materials on the site. Similar question, I'm just curious if you can remind us how often you're out there on the site and what you're looking for when you're there.
Of course. Let me start with an introduction of myself. I'm Mickey Pierce. I'm a senior hazardous materials specialist with the Department of Environmental Health in the Hazardous Materials Compliance Division. And what we do is a little more complex than just hazardous materials storage on site. We oversee 6 different state and federal programs that are interlaced together, generally referred to as the Unified Program. That includes hazardous waste, hazardous materials business plan, which is community right to know and disclosure of hazardous material storage. We have underground storage tanks. We have the Above Ground Petroleum Storage Act, which you should probably be able to figure out the name. And then we have what's called the CalARP, or California Accidental Release Program, which is the California version of the federal RMP, or, oh geez, drew a blank. Too many acronyms, sorry. So we take all those programs plus the Hazardous Materials Storage Ordinance, which is part of the county ordinance that Mr. Rossi referred to. And we go out and do routine inspections of all those programs across the property. Generally, we've divided up the property into about 16 or 17 different, we refer to them as facilities, but they're generally buildings or functional areas. And our goal is to get out and do complete inspections of all the different aspects that I just named at each facility each time we go out.
And again, how often would you say someone from your team is out on site?
We have a stated goal of inspection at least every 3 years. That's a little different with respect to the underground storage tank on site, or tanks. Those we are mandated by law to visit every year.
And Mr. Pierce, I'm going to just anticipate reaction from folks. I'm sure there are some folks out there saying every 3 years. It doesn't sound like you're out there that often. How can you possibly get the job done if you're only out there every 3 years?
Sometimes we ask ourselves that question too. It's mainly a numbers game and scope. We have over 5,000 regulated hazardous waste generators alone. So we range everywhere from your dentist to your major manufacturer, and about 12,000 total things that we need to regulate on a regular basis. We work with the state in when we became a unified program agency, we work with the state and we used their guidelines and the acceptable work practices that they laid out to come up with that 3-year schedule. And that's what we've been doing for the last, I don't know, 20 years now.
And Mr. Pierce, I'm going off script here a little bit, but does that mean you're a Koopa?
That means we are a Koopa, yes.
And I remember this from my days chairing the Senate Environmental Quality Committee in the state legislature. But I know you would never use this opportunity to lobby the board for more staffing. But if you had more staffing, would you be able to get out there more often?
We would just be happy if we could fill our positions currently. But yeah, okay. I would like to say, Supervisor Simitian, that there is one thing that we are looking at doing to try and maintain a better presence out at Lehigh. Historically, we have worked with Lehigh, and we would go out and we would do these 15 and 16 facilities over the course of 15 or 16 weeks, try and lump them all together. Our historic inspector at the site retired this year. So we are examining other approaches to the site, like spreading things out over that 3-year period, in an attempt to maintain a better ongoing relationship, a better set of eyes over a period of time. So that is one thing that I think it was brought up in one of these meetings before, and that we think is a reasonable way to attack larger facilities. It's consistent with what we do with other large campus type facilities like Stanford University or San Jose State University.
All right, thank you. Before I move on to the folks at County Planning, how would you characterize compliance with hazardous waste storage requirements over the course of the past year?
As with everyone else, 2021 for us was a fairly quiet year. We had just 4 inspections, 2 of which were relating to some construction project. One end of it was the demolition of an existing tank and piping system that's used for chemical injection to keep water quality. The other end of that was the installation of the new chemical delivery system. So that kind of bracketed the year. Accounted for 2 of our 4 stops. And then we had a routine inspection for our underground storage tank. And even though the kiln is down, which means that production is really down, there's not going to be not a whole lot of activity out there. We did fit in 1 routine inspection, which went fairly well. There were some violations noted, but Lehigh they get 30 days to come back into compliance and demonstrate to us that they've fixed the things we've asked, and they were able to do that with our routine inspection.
All right, thank you. Thank you again. We'll be back to you, I think. And but first, let me turn to the County Planning team and ask one of that team to go ahead and make introductions.
Thank you, Supervisor Simitian. My name is Lisa McKyle. I'm the Planning Manager with the Department of Planning and Development here at the county. I oversee the operations and functions of the Planning Division, as well as supervise the planning staff who review development applications here at the county for compliance with the zoning ordinance, our ordinance code, and also any state laws. I have with me today Rob Salisbury, the Senior Planner. Rob, you can go ahead and introduce yourself and your functions overseeing Lehigh.
Thank you, Lisa. My name is Rob Salisbury. As Lisa mentioned, I'm a Senior Planner with the county. I administer the county's Surface Mining and Reclamation Act program. So essentially what I do is try to make sure that Lehigh is complying with the terms of their approved reclamation plan. And perhaps most importantly, making sure that they're correctly estimating the cost of reclamation based on current conditions and posting the financial mechanism required to conduct that reclamation should Lehigh be financially incapable.
All right. And Ms. McKyle, what is the current status of the reclamation plan amendment that Lehigh first submitted back in 2019? It's been a confusing paper trail here, but if I recall correctly, it's been more than 2 years now since there was an amendment submitted, or an application for an amendment submitted. What's the status of that rec plan amendment?
Sure. Lehigh's most recent application for reclamation plan amendment was deemed complete for processing in November of 2019. However, recently in December of 2021, Lehigh informed the department that they do plan to amend their application. And as a result, the department has suspended processing the reclamation plan amendment until a revised project is submitted for county review. Additionally, the county sent a letter to Lehigh after we found out that they'd like to amend their application, and did encourage the applicant to consider withdrawing their application.
So for all intents and purposes, there is no application pending for any different use than is already authorized under the 2011 and 2012 actions. Is that a fair statement on my part?
That's correct. We do not have a current application outside of what they're already approved for.
All right. And I'd also just like to ask, since I've asked others, has county planning issued any violations to Lehigh since we met last year?
At this time, no. The department issued a notice of violation for the Permanente Creek sediment discharge back in June of 2019, which has been abated to date.
All right. And Mr. Salisbury, you mentioned in passing the financial assurance cost estimate, or FACE as it's called by acronym. And I gather what you're communicating is that this is essentially the insurance policy that when the time comes to put it back together again, the money will be there to get it done. Did I summarize that colloquially but correctly?
Yes, you did, Supervisor.
All right. And where are we in the review of that sufficiency or adequacy for 2021? That's a process. So where are we in that process?
So Lehigh submitted a FACE, financial assurance cost estimate, and the department reviewed it and had numerous questions, and sent a letter to Lehigh asking them to clarify and revise that financial assurance cost estimate. And we expect Lehigh to resubmit that revised FACE in early April.
All right. So we're in the process of reviewing it carefully, and we've retained outside expertise to make sure that it's done rigorously. Yes?
Correct.
All right. Let's move on to the Water District after I say thank you again to the planning folks. And we'll move on to the Water District. And I should be clear, they should not be confused with the Water Board. And Ms. Garcia will perhaps clarify who's who, what's what, who does what. If you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we'll have a couple of questions for you that are relevant to your work at the Water District.
Sure. Thank you, Supervisor Simitian. So my name is Victoria Garcia. I'm a water resources specialist in the groundwater management unit at Valley Water. Valley Water is the groundwater sustainability agency for Santa Clara County. And we actively manage and monitor our groundwater subbasins and replenish them with local and imported water. So more specifically, what Valley Water does is we provide safe, clean water, flood protection, stewardship of streams within Santa Clara County, and we own and operate 10 reservoirs, 3 water treatment plants, 1 water purification center, and manage about 275 miles of creeks. Unlike most of the agencies represented here, we do not have regulatory or enforcement authority. However, we do work closely with the regulatory agencies and municipalities and provide technical assistance when needed.
And Ms. Garcia, as I mentioned, I think it's easy and understandable for folks to confuse the water district with Valley Water with our Regional Water Quality Control Board. Are there any activities at Lehigh that are actually, quote, overseen by Valley Water? And let me just stop there and start with that, I guess.
No, so the regional board has the regulatory authority over groundwater and surface water quality.
All right, but you do assess the quality of the groundwater, yes?
Yes, we do.
All right, so if people have questions about what the groundwater quality is, you are the appropriate place to go, at least for tonight's meeting. I'll say thank you for that. And are there any findings that we should be aware of? My recollection is that there were groundwater wells that the district was monitoring at some period for some period of time. Any findings there that we should be aware of?
So Valley Water does monitor various wells across the county, and we did a specific analysis for the Lehigh site. So what we did was we analyzed arsenic, mercury, and selenium data from water supply wells within a 4-mile radius of the Lehigh site. And the results show that there are no contamination exceedances as it relates to state maximum levels.
All right. And does that mean then that people can feel comfortable about drinking water in the surrounding community, for example?
That's correct. So it's important to note that the quarry is located in bedrock, which is outside of the groundwater subbasin. So most of the residents within the subbasin, which is downstream of the quarry, receive their drinking water from the city of Cupertino or California Water Company. And these water systems are regulated by the Division of Drinking Water and have stringent testing requirements that ensure that the water delivered is safe to drink.
All right. Thank you very much. And I will just end our run down the panel before we go to your questions. So for those of you who've been patiently waiting for your questions, we'll get to them in just a minute. But I want to introduce Mr. Mosley from the city of Cupertino, ask you to introduce yourself and your organization, what your role is here, and then we'll talk a little bit about, I'll have a question, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the issues that are specific to Cupertino. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Supervisor Simitian. My name is Chad Mosley. I'm the Assistant Director of Public Works with the City of Cupertino. Cupertino does not have direct oversight of the Lehigh Quarry and Cement plant, but Cupertino is Lehigh's closest neighbor to the east. Their operations directly impact our residents, including the effects of not only quarry operations, but access to the property, which requires travel over Cupertino streets. So we're basically monitoring information and activities associated with Lehigh's operations, and we provide input to various regulating agencies.
And Mr. Mosley, how long have you been with the city of Cupertino now?
I've been with the city of Cupertino for approximately 12 years in various capacities.
Right. So that means that you were there a couple of years ago when the access road issue came up. I am remembering very well, not only hearing from our common constituents, but from the city itself. Can you just refresh folks' memories on what that was all about when that haul road was built over to Stevens Creek Quarry and impacted those parcels? Any update you can give us about that work?
So the city's been coordinating with Lehigh on plans to correct that grading violation. We've reviewed and agreed to a restoration concept, which would ensure that Hall Road within Cupertino's jurisdiction, at least, is restored more or less to its original condition. However, Lehigh has now modified its reclamation plan amendment application to include the Hall Road. So, addressing the Hall Road will be part of the county's process as well. But we have come up with a concept and have been working to come up with a final design to get that project started and completed.
All right. Thank you very much for that. Thank you to all the panelists. A lot of information there. And I should just mention that when we had roughly 250 folks on the call at the peak, and an hour in, we still had 240 some. So folks have really hung in there, and thank you for that. Let's go to the questions now. We're going to start off with some of the questions that were submitted in advance, along with some of the frequently asked questions our audience receives. And then, as I say, go to audience questions. And please remember, as you have been, to use that Q&A function if you've got questions, and do not use the raise hand function. And let me just begin with a question for planning, county planning. The questioner asks, and there's some built-in assumptions here, which you can feel free to respond to as well if you like. The question for planning is, will Lehigh be granted further mining or expansion concessions? Have they been cut off? And if not, why not? So why don't we call that a question to planning, and maybe a question to County Counsel's office as well about how permission is given for additional mining or expansion of activities on the site. Mr. Salisbury, what would you like to tell us?
Thank you, Supervisor. So as you alluded to earlier, the board made a determination that Lehigh has a vested right to mine in certain geographic areas. So Lehigh does not need a use permit and does not strictly need permission to start mining in those specified geographic areas. What they do need to get permission for, though, is how any new areas will be reclaimed. And so that the application that the department was processing and has suspended processing was a plan explaining exactly how those new areas would be reclaimed once mining has ended.
All right.
But we are bound by that vested rights determination made by the board in 2011.
All right. And Mr. Salisbury, I'm just going to say again for folks out there, this is a decision that was made prior to my coming back on the board. And when I emphasized that last year, I had some folks who say, well, you're just trying to make sure we know that, we can't hold you responsible for that. And I said, that's exactly right. I am. I'm also trying to make sure folks understand that that is a constraint that the current board has to live and work with as we address issues at the site. And, there's some who were critical of the decisions by a prior board. Fair enough. But they are now on the books, and we have to do the best we can with what was on the books when we all arrived on the scene. Let me just say, if we can bring Ms. Pianka and Mr. Rossi back in as well, I think the question here is, have they been cut off? And if not, why not? Mr. Rossi, I know you get these questions from time to time, which, in a slightly less tactful way might be, what does it take to cut somebody off and say you're in violation? Could you tell folks a little bit about how you approach that? You started to address that a little bit earlier, and I'd like to ask you to expand on that a little bit, since you are the enforcer in the county counsel's office.
Certainly. So it really depends on the facts and circumstances and the type of violation we're talking about as to when we issue a notice of violation or take other action if we don't receive compliance from that notice of violation. So certainly happy to answer any question you have in mind regarding a specific type of violation.
So the way the question comes most often and most simply to me in my office is, Well, if they're in violation, why do they get to keep operating? Because there are notices of violation. So what would you say to people?
I would say that with respect to the quarries, when we have issued notices of violation, we are obligated under the county ordinance code and state law to allow for a compliance period to come back into compliance. And most frequently, we receive compliance in those circumstances such that no further action needs to be taken.
Does that mean that when you issue a notice of violation, it is the quarry equivalent of a fix-it ticket?
I guess one could make that observation. Hopefully, it's more serious. It carries with it more serious consequences than a fix-it ticket, but fortunately, the county's NOVs have been taken seriously and met with compliance such that we haven't had to take any further compliance steps.
But the fundamental, and again, feel free to clarify or correct if need be. The fundamental notion is, all right, a violation has been identified. Someone is put on notice that they are in violation, and then there is a reasonable opportunity for them to get themselves back into compliance if they want to keep operating. Yes?
That's correct.
All right. We have a couple of questions still for planning and county counsel's office about the reclamation process and abandonment. And I'm going to put the two questions together. One question is, what criteria are used to determine if a mine is abandoned and restoration must begin? And the second question is, when will the county enforce reclamation? And, I think what the questioner is getting to, Mr. Salisbury, and then I'll turn to the legal team again, is the expectation that mining can occur on the site in perpetuity, or, at some point, is there an end to this activity? And does that end come about if the mine's been abandoned? And how do we know if a mine has been abandoned? And when will the county be able to enforce a reclamation effort? I know a lot of that's pretty legal, so I'll let you answer the piece you're comfortable with, and then we'll go to the lawyers.
Very good. Thank you, Supervisor. So under SMARA.
And hang on, SMARA would be what?
The Surface Mining and Reclamation Act.
Thank you.
Thank you. So under SMARA, quarries have to produce a certain amount of material each year, and that's a proportion of their maximum production over the past few years. As long as they stay at or above that level, they're considered active. They're allowed to essentially continue operating as per normal. If they fell below that level, they'd be considered idle under SMARA, and at that time they would either have to start reclamation, restart their operation, or file what's called an interim management plan, which allows a quarry to be idle, in other words, inactive, for up to 15 years total. Regarding reclamation, that is governed by the reclamation plan on file. That, in this case with Lehigh, it was approved in 2011, and it does contain specific plans for how the site will be reclaimed, as well as estimated timelines for when reclamation will be conducted. But unless the operator falls below their production level and becomes idle, we don't have very strong ability to require them to, at any particular point in time, conduct reclamation. But certainly once the mining has occurred to the level that is allowed by the reclamation plan, then at that time, reclamation would need to occur.
All right. Let me go to Ms. Pianka and Mr. Rossi. Again, questions about reclamation and abandonment, and whether there's any ability to essentially force an end to these activities and a reclamation of the site.
So I think that Robert Salisbury kind of described very well the steps that would be taken to determine abandonment and to kind of start the reclamation process. And the initial step is really kind of having an idle or an interim management plan and a determination that it is inactive. But we're not in a position to kind of deem the site abandoned until those conditions precedent have been fulfilled. And I would add that on an annual basis, Lehigh, under the reclamation plan that they are governed by, must submit an annual report to the county. It is considered by our board of supervisors, our planning commission. And that does provide what I would say is annual status updates as to the progress associated with reclamation as it relates to their mining activities as well.
Mr. Rossi, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think Mr. Salisbury and Ms. Pianka have captured it accurately.
And let me just ask, my memory, and this is a lot of ground to cover, literally and figuratively, my memory is that one of the conditions of approval on the quarry is that the current rec plan, essentially the reclamation effort anticipated by the current rec plan has to commence by 2032 unless a new rec plan amendment application is submitted. Am I remembering that right? Does that ring any bells? Or is that so deep in the weeds that even our team has forgotten that one?
So the reclamation plan and the conditions of approval do have estimated dates as to when mining would be complete and reclamation would commence. And I believe that is the approximately correct date, yes.
All right. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean that we had someone actually in touch who said, well, you know, why would you consider acquisition of the site if it's going to come to you free and clear in 2032? Whatever the reclamation plan conditions require, they don't involve the transfer of the property to the county in 2032. Can I get that's absolutely right from everybody there nodding and smiling behind their mask?
Correct.
All right,
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for that. All right, then let me go to questions that deal with the air quality and water quality as well, if I may. So Air District, does anyone know when the kiln is planned for a restart? And do we know why it's down? So let me go back to Mr. Marvin. We talked about this a little earlier, but Mr. Marvin, you know, some, I think, natural curiosity about the kiln being down, and do we know when there's a planned restart?
We don't know when there's a planned restart. They haven't shared that information with us, and I guess that's a business decision that they'll have to make.
All right. Let me ask you, the next question for the Air District is there a place on your website where people who want to get into the historical data can find it, specifically things like mercury levels or other air pollutants? Is there, if somebody goes to the website, what can they find that information, and if so, where?
That's a great question. I'd rather leave that for our written questions because we'll have to do some research on that one.
All right. So if the questioner will just hold that thought, we'll make sure that that's one of the questions that we get a written answer to. And Mr. Marvin, thank you for committing to giving us a written answer on that, because as I said, we get to most, usually virtually all, but this year there's so many we may not be able to get to them all, but we'll come back to that one. Another question is from someone who just wants to know, are sensors used to monitor air quality on site? In other words, do you have on-site air quality sensors?
I think what they're talking about are some of these inexpensive sensors that people actually have in their homes and can use, like the purple, I guess the purple, I forget what it's called, but these are sensors that are rather inexpensive that can be used by regular and normal residents. No, they don't have those types of sensors there. What they do have are the continuous emission monitoring systems, and I already talked about that.
And those systems are on site and in place year round?
They're on site, in place year round.
All right. And the follow-up question was, are the standards being met? And I heard you say earlier, yes, they are.
Yes, we've had no violations, but again, it hasn't been operated.
All right. And somewhat broader question, an interesting and intriguing one, says, how are agencies adapting their rules to deal with climate change and air quality impacts associated with things like wildfires, for example?
So, well, we have a whole program set up for wildfire response. We have a number of projects underway. I'm really not the expert on that, but things like, let's see, we have grant projects that are giving money away for air filters for residents, usually through through other agency programs or local programs. So we have a lot of information and a lot of things that you can discover on our website regarding our wildfire response program. In terms of greenhouse gases, we have a whole climate protection program devoted to greenhouse gas emissions and their control.
All right. And this next question has a built-in assumption, and I'll let you respond to it if you wish. It says, can you explain why the district seems to have revised down the initial elevated cancer risk it calculated in association with the aggregate plant in 2021?
I don't know that information, so I'd rather not comment on it.
All right. Why don't we make that one of the questions we'll ask you to help us give a written answer to, and we'll get it up on our website, and I'll share that information again at the end of the conversation. All right. Then we'll say thank you to the folks at the Air District for a minute, and going to Valley Water, again, understanding their limited role here. The question does have to do with monitoring water quality, and it's, can the Water District compare the monitoring wells results? Can those be compared to residential screening levels so the public can understand if the current conditions meet the residential screening level requirements? I'm going to try and translate that a little bit in case it wasn't entirely clear. I think the question is asking, is it possible to look at the levels that you get from monitoring the wells and compare them to standard residential drinking water screening levels and say they're as good as, they're better than, they're worse than? Ms. Garcia, what do you think?
Yeah, so I did read this question as well, and I think the question pertains to the monitoring wells on site that monitor shallow groundwater at the site, because those are the wells that are on GeoTracker. So we wouldn't be able to do that at Valley Water. However, as I mentioned before, we monitor principal groundwater quality or aquifer data, and we do compare those to state standards.
All right, thank you for that. Let me go to the city of Cupertino and our planning department here at the county and the Air District for a very simple but very big question. Someone wants to know, how can we limit truck traffic? Mr. Mosley, I see you deep in thought.
That's a complicated question. With the limiting of truck traffic would have to do with operations at Lehigh. So I think the operations at Lehigh would need to be limited in order to reduce traffic flows. Cupertino is responsible for keeping public streets open for use by both residents and businesses. So there's not much that we can do as a city.
Let me go to the planning department. Question again, how can we limit truck traffic?
Well, that is a difficult question with respect to Lehigh. Because they do not have a use permit, we do not have the ability to directly regulate traffic on a trip-by-trip basis. And of course, the traffic that the residents of Cupertino experience is also results from a neighboring quarry as well. So it is a rather complicated issue, but without a use permit, again, we don't have the ability to directly limit the truck traffic that Lehigh conducts.
I see Ms. McKyle's screen is lit up as well. Would you like to weigh in on this one?
I have nothing further to add. Mr. Salisbury responded.
Let me ask you a leading question then, Ms. McKyle and Mr. Salisbury and County Council as well. One way in which truck traffic can be and has been limited, and Mr. Mosley as well, is by enforcing the regulations governing the two sites, the Stevens Creek Quarry site and the Lehigh site, with respect to that unauthorized road between the two sites, to make sure that that didn't generate additional truck trips. Is that a fair recollection from a couple of years back? Mr. Rossi, I see you popping in. Anyone?
That's correct, Supervisor. Go ahead, Mr. Salisbury.
I apologize, Mr. Rossi. That is correct to an extent. There was, however, fairly limited traffic along that route, and it did have the advantage of at least not being on Cupertino city streets. But since the NOV was issued, that internal haul road is no longer being used.
And that internal haul road, though, Mr. Salisbury, did then lead to additional activity on the sites, which led to additional truck traffic from the sites. Am I remembering that right, Mr. Rossi and Mr. Mosley?
That's correct. Due to the transport of materials between both Stevens Creek Quarry and Lehigh, that did seem to generate additional truck traffic.
All right.
And to your earlier point, Supervisor, the way that we limited truck traffic was to recognize that the importation of materials by Stevens Creek Quarry from Lehigh Quarry was in excess of their allowed use. And we issued a notice of violation in 2019 to enforce the appropriate use of the quarry such that that reduced truck traffic.
All right. Thank you all. I'm going to jump back to planning. There is a question saying, can we get more detail on the financial status of the reclamation? That calculation is underway as we speak. And can either Ms. McKyle or Mr. Salisbury recall, we're getting a report on that, as if I remember correctly, is it at our Housing, Land Use, Environment, Transportation Committee?
That is correct, yes.
And do you happen to remember which month that comes back to us now in the timeline, Mr. Salisbury?
My recollection is May.
And I won't put you on the spot, but I will check my own calendar and see if in real time, let's see if I can pull this information up. I believe that meeting is scheduled for May the 19th. And that would be a time for folks who are concerned about whether or not the reclamation effort is fully funded, or at least there's a guarantee that it will be fully funded. I can get more clarity on that, assuming we stay on that schedule. All right. Thank you for that. Another question about truck traffic, which I think we've done. So here's a question for any and all takers. And the question is, well, with the kiln shut down, what is going on at the site? So presumably if we have folks out there doing on-site inspections, someone can tell us that. Mr. Salisbury, you want to give it a try?
Yeah, absolutely. So Lehigh has a separate permit for their cement plant. So it's a separately permitted use from their mining activity. And the way that use is described in their use permit is for the production and storage of cement. So at the moment, Lehigh facility is not producing cement, but they are importing already produced cement from other facilities and then selling it and shipping it from the Lehigh facility. And we have no knowledge of if and when the kiln and cement production will restart.
And presumably, Mr. Salisbury, if they're importing and selling cement, your department and working with county council has determined that that's a lawful activity on the site, yes?
Correct.
And are they also making and selling aggregate in terms of the other operations that are there?
Yeah, they recently restarted their aggregate production operation. This is a long-standing product that they've extracted and sold historically, essentially as far back as Lehigh has been in operation, although it is a little bit intermittent. And they did recently, as you noted, restart that aggregate production and sale use.
Okay, and let me tie this into a question that we just got for county council, which is, since the kiln is out, how can there be sufficient activity to say the operation is fully active and not actually abandoned? And let me just ask the team, is this a confusion between the kiln and the cement plant activity and the mine and quarry activity, or is there some other explanation that you can share?
Well, I'll jump in and start. So, I would defer to Rob Salisbury on the activity, the mining production and those mining numbers, because that's what would determine whether the mine is considered idle. And the mining, as Mr. Salisbury mentioned earlier, is separate from the cement plant. The cement plant is governed by a use permit that was issued in 1939 by the county. And as Mr. Salisbury mentioned, that use permit provides for the storage of cement, and that could include the importation and storage at the site. And so, based on the county's understanding today, at the cement plant, they are storing cement.
All right. I think that distinction between the cement plant activity and the quarry activity and the entitlements is a confusing but important one, Ms. Bianca. I think most folks just think of it as the 3,500 acres that is the Lehigh property, and understandably don't have any reason to think of it as two different activities. The question for planning is, will Lehigh be allowed to mine in unvested areas? I think I know the answer to that question, but I'm going to let planning answer it because the question went to them.
They would only be able to mine in unvested parcels if they applied for and received a use permit to do so.
Okay.
And a reclamation plan amendment as well.
And how long is that process likely to take if it commences, which it hasn't?
I would think that would be a couple of year process.
Okay, just I wanted to give folks some sense of assurance that that wasn't going to happen, on the quick, so to speak. I'm going to give the panelists a bit of a break now because I'm going to take some questions that are directed to me, which is perfectly fine. One of the questions is, what are the reasons for the county to propose purchase of cement plant and quarry? Then related to that, how to fund the purchase, what's the estimated cost of purchasing, what will happen if the county buys it, future use, spark something else, how will construction costs be impacted if Lehigh closes, how can the public help support the county in acquiring Lehigh, and is there a study of potential usage, design, and build out scenarios for after the site is restored? Again, is there a study of potential usage, design, and build out scenarios for after the site is stored? Let me just share with folks what has happened and sort of where we are in this process. For a variety of reasons, which I will share briefly, I thought that as a member of the Board of Supervisors, it was the appropriate time to ask our staff here at the county to lay out some options for the possible acquisition of the site by the county. The reasons for that are many, but to kind of reduce them to just a few of the most important ones. Number one, we're at a point where I think it's clear that the ownership of the Lehigh facility is reevaluating what it wants to do with that site. And I say that because the folks at Lehigh, Heidelberg Cement, I believe, is the parent company off in Germany. And the folks we deal with these days are headquartered in Texas. They've made the judgment that they wanted to sell off their Western United States properties, and they have done that. They have sold all of their other Lehigh Western States properties because they were pretty straightforward, frankly, as these things go. And they had a buyer, I believe it was Martin Marietta, who said, sure, we'd like to pick up your business. And they bought those properties and are off doing that now. Lehigh represented apparently a unique case because it wasn't part of the package. And that decision by Lehigh, coupled with the fact that they decided not to move forward on their 2019 application for a new reclamation plan, suggests that they are in the process of evaluating what the future for this parcel might look like. In following up with the folks at Lehigh and talking with them just preliminarily, that seems to be borne out by the conversations we've had. So I think we are at a pivot point, perhaps a time of receptivity. We will find out as we pursue these things. That's one of the reasons why I think the time is right to be having this conversation. I also think the time is right to be having this conversation because we have had a series of violations, and different folks will have different points of view. Some say this critically, others say, look, that's what's going to happen if you have a cement plant, a quarry. There are going to be some issues along the way, but we have a series of violations. That's why I asked if we could get essentially a summary of violations over the last 10 years to take a more comprehensive look at this rather than just deal with these issues piecemeal. But I think it is clear, my view, I think it's clear that whatever the decisions of the past have been, they present a continuing problem in terms of the adjacency of open space on one side, residential development on the other, and a 3,500 acre quarry and cement plant in the middle. That's not been easy, and it's not been without challenges. And so I think rather than simply, and this would be the third point I would make, rather than simply sort of waiting to see what happens and letting the years go by, I thought it was time, and some would say it was past time, to say, look, what's a sensible future for this site? And can we chart that out ourselves rather than just let ourselves accept whatever comes our way as a county? So I asked the staff through the Board of Supervisors here at the county to come back with some possibilities. I think it is far too early to have any idea what that range of possibilities will look like. It is early days. It was genuinely as much a question as it was a proposal. In the East Bay at the Dumbarton Quarry, they have reclaimed a quarry and turned it into a marvelous park and campground. So we know it can be done. How such a thing might be funded remains to be seen. Certainly Lehigh has a financial interest in avoiding the $60 to $100 million that reclamation is probably going to entail. There might be some very modest housing potential on the site. And before anyone is up in arms or panics, I said might be. The site might be amenable to repurposing as open space if it can be reclaimed. We don't know a lot of things yet. We don't know, for example, what kind of contamination, including contamination unrelated to the cement plant and the quarry there might be. At one point, I seem to recall there was reference to munitions on the site. So lots and lots of questions, but in my view, an opportune time, given the fact that Lehigh has sold off the rest of its properties, is clearly looking to consider what the path forward might be. We know that it's a challenging dynamic given the other uses that are right next door, and we know that it can be done. With all of that, it seemed to me it was time to start being a little more deliberate about asking these questions and pursuing some other possibilities. I hope that answers many of those questions, and stay tuned because our staff will be reporting back to us sometime in the next couple of months, at least preliminarily, on their thinking, and we will certainly publicize that when the time comes. And then sort of a random question, which says, Joe, when will we have in-person meetings again? I don't know if that means this meeting or just county meetings in general. The short answer is when the county health officer gives the indication that that is going to be safe and appropriate. I think it remains to be seen just how we will manage the new normal as people describe it. You know, interestingly enough, doing this meeting virtually produced the largest attendance we've ever had at the meeting. So I think some hybrid meetings are likely in our future, and I'll just let it go at that because I want to get back to your other questions. We have answered that question about what's happening at the site. A question for any taker is, does Lehigh have plans to build a low emission cement plant? Again, the question is, does Lehigh have plans to build a low emission cement plant? And could the county require them to do that? Anybody?
I'd be happy to take a stab at it, Supervisor.
Please do.
We have no indication from Lehigh that they have any plans to do so. Certainly, if they did want to do that, that's something the county would work with them to try to achieve. But it would require likely a modification of their cement plant use permit.
All right. Is it possible, Mr. Salisbury or County Council, that it's under some circumstances the county might require the construction of a low emission cement plant?
Certainly, I can start, and I think it may not be an answer that is specific, but I think it depends. It would depend on the proposal. I think there are also, in addition to the county's regulations that really govern use permits and operations, there are a number of other regulatory agencies involved in oversight of a cement operation. And so I think we would be looking at the regulations at the point in time when there was an application submitted. We would also be looking at the environmental impacts associated with a new cement plant or a modification, and alternatives that would be evaluated in any EIR that may include a cement plant that was low emissions.
Thank you, Elizabeth Pianca from the County Council's office. May I take it that that I'm going to keep you pulled in here. Thank you, Ms. Pianca. May I take it then? I thought I heard you to say that such a thing might be more likely if there was a new application to which new conditions could be attached from the county standpoint.
That's correct. I mean, the existing use permit is a use permit, and the county does not solely have the ability to go in and modify that use permit. It would be prompted by an application by the owner.
All right. Here's a question that is a sort of a standalone. It's, what is the status of the railroad? Anybody know what that answer is?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that, Supervisor.
Please do.
To my understanding, the rail line is primarily used for importation of the fuel that's required to run the cement plant kiln. And it seems, and it's a question we've been looking into and tracking, and have been requesting additional information from Lehigh about. It's been seemingly has been quiet lately, but But again, primarily our understanding is it's used for the importation of fuel.
All right. We have some water questions. And again, I know we're somewhat handicapped by the lack of the folks from the Bay Area water quality folks, but let's see if anyone can respond. And Ms. Garcia, if this is not in your bailiwick, we'll certainly understand. If the folks from planning or other agencies can step in, that would be helpful. Let me just read a few of them, and you can jot a note and see if there's any light we can shed. What's the status of water contamination, both in terms of water from the pit and runoff into the creek? When will the Permanente Creek project begin, and when will it be completed? How often is the creek monitored for selenium and other toxins? And what's the current health of the creek habitat for fish and other animals? Who would like to weigh in on any of those? Is the service still with us? Somebody from Fish and Wildlife by any chance can help with any of those?
I can provide a bit of information.
Please do, Mr. Salisbury, and then we'll let Mr. Terry in if he thinks he wants to help us answer this question. And I see Ms. Garcia is still with us, so that's good too. All right, let's try with you, Mr. Salisbury.
So the primary contaminant of concern at Lehigh from the county's perspective is selenium. And that's a contaminant that the county receives regular reports about. And recently, pleased to report that levels of selenium in the Lehigh's discharge water have gone down significantly. Through their 2011 Reclamation Plan amendment, they were required to monitor selenium levels in their discharge water, and if they exceeded certain thresholds, they would be required to put in a treatment plant. So that occurred. They were exceeding those selenium threshold levels, and so they were required to and did install a treatment system. And that treatment system continues to operate today and has served to reduce levels of selenium in their discharge water significantly. They do, during 2021, they had no exceedances of the Regional Water Quality Control Board selenium standard, but they did have two minor exceedances of the selenium standard during 2020.
All right, and Mr. Terry, any chance you can help us with the second part of that question, which is the current health of the creek habitat for fish and other animals?
I don't know, I'll try. So I'll say, just to follow up with what Robert said, that yes, it was concerning that historically that there were high levels of selenium in the creek. And as was stated, I believe previously, the health standards for the environment, it takes a lot less selenium to be hazardous than it does for human health. And so historically, yes, it would have been an issue for California red-legged frogs, but since they currently are mostly in compliance with selenium levels, that possibly it's less of an issue, except for some recent violations and exceedances. We got some comments during the, when we submitted the Habitat Conservation Plan for public comment. That was some of the comments we received. We'll be looking at those and responding to those. And we will also maybe evaluating under the cumulative effects analysis in our biological opinion for the Habitat Conservation Plan.
And there was a very direct question about the Permanente Creek project and when it will begin and when it will be complete. Mr. Salisbury, is that one that's in your bailiwick?
Yes, it is. So the final stages in preparation of the supplemental EIR, environmental impact report that's required for the restoration plan. So we're very close to circulating that document. Once that document is circulated, Lehigh would need to apply for certain jurisdictional permits from several of the agencies that are in attendance tonight. And then once those jurisdictional permits were in hand, they could start the work. if my memory serves, it's roughly a 5-year plan of work. And I would think, hopefully, depending on when agency permits were acquired, work might actually commence probably 2024, I would think, and then run for about 5 years, like I said.
All right. Thank you. Let me go to Fish and Wildlife with a question specifically for you. The questioner asks, how often do habitat conservation plans actually work? How long are they monitored for success? And if they fail, are there any penalties?
And I was actually going to take that one.
Okay.
Go to it.
Joseph a break because he had those other questions before. Yeah, I'm not really sure on the first part what they mean if they work. I mean, they always, I don't know of any cases where they haven't worked. Anyway, but they are monitored for success throughout the permit term. And the Lehigh one is a 20-year permit term. So that would be monitored, and we'd be monitoring to make sure they're doing all the minimization measures and protecting the listed species as they were going to propose that they were going to do. And for Lehigh in particular, they also have, if they fail their penalties, yes, they could lose their permit. For Lehigh, they put up a bond money, $2 million that they would not get back if they did not follow the measures that they would do. They would get that money back at the very end of the permit term. And that money is just put away in case they didn't do the measures that the service or some would hire somebody to go do those measures. So that's what that money is for.
All right. And one last question, because we're almost out of time, and this is for any and all. Are there any outstanding fines that Lehigh should be paying? Are there any delinquencies? So I'll just ask if there's planning, any outstanding fines that you're aware of?
No, Supervisor.
All right, Fish and Wildlife?
No, none on ours.
All right. Anybody else? I don't want to call out each group by name, but anybody else? All right. Well, that's encouraging. Thank you for that. And as I say, we are very close to running out of time. And I do think it's important to respect our 8:30 end time. So I want to, at this point, thank the panelists. Their presence obviously was essential, crucial to the success of the conversation this evening. And I think they deserve a round of virtual applause, even if we're not all in the same room together, literally. And again, thanks for taking the time to be here. Want to thank all of those of you who showed up tonight to hear about these recent actions. I note that more than 200 of you are still with us after 2 hours, and that's no small thing. A question that didn't get asked tonight, but that I have been asked in the past is sort of what's my position on these issues? And I think at one level, as complicated as it all is, it's fairly simple. I think the operators should follow the law, and I think the regulatory agencies should do their job. And so I hope you leave tonight's meeting feeling a little more confident that this sort of alphabet soup of public agencies is in fact on the job and getting the job done. As I mentioned earlier, we will take the questions and do our level best to get answers to all of the unasked questions tonight and get them up on the website at supervisorsimidian.org. Encourage you to go there, and we will also have this 2-hour meeting there for those of you who would like to drop into a piece of it again and or share it with friends and neighbors. So with that, thank yous all around. We will keep on the job. We'll see how these various other efforts and issues get resolved. But my thanks to all for your deep, deep level of concern and for caring enough to be with us tonight. Thank you. I'm County Supervisor Joe Simitian, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care.